probably the less said about the supermoon, the better, I suspect. Well, welcome everyone. My remit this morning is to take you from the sort of early days of observations of the moon, when it's entrenched in folklore, in religion, in timekeeping, and move through that up to when the moon is being regarded as a scientific object. And you've got this sort of astronomical study of the moon as an entity in its position within the solar system. It, of course, is the dominant element of the night sky. The moon's been monitored and observed by cultures all over the world for thousands and thousands of years. And it's got a fundamental role in the astronomy, the astrology, the cosmology of all these cultures. And it's very easy to see why, because like the sun, the moon rises in the east, sets in the west. It follows a similar arc across the night sky. But it's the only body in the whole, pantheon of the heavens that changes its appearance from one day to the next. So you've got this change from where it's invisible as the new moon, to a sliver, through to a crescent, right through to the full moon, and then it disappears again. So it's not just changing its shape, it's changing its brightness, it's changing its position relative to the stars in the background sky. And there are also ways in which the fact that it goes through this cycle every 29 days, well, there's obvious ties to the cycle of birth and human mortality down here on Earth that is linked to in a lot of these sort of folklore and religions. The other thing, of course, that's unique about the moon is that, again, it's the only body that with the unaided eye you can see features on the surface, these patterns of light and dark markings that we call the maria, the misleading name, the Latin for seas on the moon, the dark basalt plains on the moon. And they create patterns, and it's the human eye makes patterns, whether it's stars into constellations or Maria on the moon into the man on the moon, the human face. Or if you like, I think the one that's slightly easier I find always to see is the rabbit in the moon, in the ears, just to show. There are a number of different rabbits in the moon, different positions. This is one squatting on his haunches, pounding rice on the moon. And there are other people. There's an old man carrying a bundle of sticks, or there are a couple of children carrying a bucket. I mean, I think some of those ancient cultures must have very imaginative ideas about how to interpret this just from these features on the moon. And most of these characters are entwined with the mythology, with the folklore connected with the culture. And often when you have representations of the moon, this will carry it through. So you've got the rabbit in the moon, or this is a Mesoamerican artifact that's showing the rabbit in the moon within a representation of the moon. And of course, depictions of the moon as it is are commonplace through petroglyphs all through the world. So in Hawaii, you've got the crescent moon, you've got the full moon and various petroglyphs on Native American sites, and there's another crescent moon there which isn't coming up very well. So you have this very early, immediate kind of reaction to the moon, connection to the moon. And it's clear, what we should be really clear about is the moon used to be a very important part of everyday life. It was integral in a way that a connection that we have lost to the moon nowadays. The early societies were much more tied to the presence of the moon and the rhythm of its changing. So not only have you got the farmers needing to know when to sow their crops, that's really crucial if you live somewhere that's only got a really short growing season. The moon also provides that late night light, enabling people to bring in the harvest during the autumn equinox. So that's the harvest moon, the full moon, just at sunset. You've got sailors needing to know when the tides are high. They need to know what's happening with the moon. You have hunters who want light for hunting at night, or travellers who want to be able to travel safely at night, all dependent on the pattern of the moon. And so the way that it changes its shape visibly from one day to the next is the basis for a calendar. If you need to do any timekeeping on timescales longer than a few days, you use the moon as a calendar. So another thing, of course, is festivals. If you have widespread communities that want to come together for a festival, religious celebration, you mark the time, you synchronise all your watches by the moon, basically. The nth moon after the previous one is when you all get together. So it's a timepiece that connects different cultures. And so it's not surprising that the word for moon and month both derive from the same Latin root, from the word, the etymology means measure. And of course, counting by the moon was important for women, monitoring their fertility, and so the word menstruation also comes from the same root, the idea of measuring and measuring time. Now, this connection of cycles maybe explains partly why a lot of the early deities for the moon are female. So the moon in nearly all the cultures is originally associated as a goddess. Here you've got, you can't really see her, just like a black silhouette. But this is the Polynesian goddess known as Hina, creator goddess. You've got Metra, the world mother in ancient Persia, is associated with the moon. Now, I've got to get this pronunciation right. Koyoksalqui. Here, in rather an unfortunate dismembered state in this representation, but in Aztec mythology, she is the goddess of the moon. So you have the moon as a goddess in her own right. More often than not, she is paired with the sun in some way. Maybe they're brother and sister, maybe they're husband and wife. In some mythologies, they're both. So, for example, you have the Incas of South America. They've got Mama Quila, who is the wife and the sister of the sun god. You have Artemis in Greek mythology, who, as well as being, the number one huntress, is also the goddess of childbirth. She's also associated with the moon. And she's the sister of the sun god, Apollo. So you have that connection. And there are Native American myths, there are myths from Western African tribes, again, with the moon and the sun as a chieftain and the wife, the husband and wife team. And even in China, in ancient China, Chang'e is the goddess of the moon. She lives on the moon with a woodcutter, and that's presumably the chap on the moon with carrying a bunch of sticks. And also, I don't know if you can see, her jade rabbit. So again, you've got the connection of the rabbit in the moon coming through. And in Chinese culture, it's associated with gentleness and brightness and families coming together. So it's a very kind of soft vision of the moon. So not beyond being personified as a deity, the moon was also seen, in some cases, as an actual place that could be inhabited. So in early Hindus, the idea was that the souls of the dead would go to the moon while they're waiting for their rebirth. And even if you go to Homer, he refers to the moon as, or associates the moon with Elysium. So it's the islands of the best where the gods send their favoured heroes. And I love this bit. The substance of the soul is left upon the moon and returns certain vestiges and dreams of life. So again, it's an actual place where people or souls go. But it is also thought to have an influence on people, again through many cultures. This isn't surprising. If the moon, and when you've got a full moon, affects the tides in the seas and affects migration of certain animals, people believe that it could affect human behaviour. And this is where you come to the idea of being moonstruck, or the idea of a temporary madness, a lunacy that occurs during a full moon. And of course, werewolves associated with a full moon. So if you acted strangely, it was supposed to be the influence of having let moonbeams cross you while you were sleeping. And even Hippocrates, father of modern medicine, in the 5th century BC, is saying, one who is seized with terror, fright, and madness during the night is being visited by the goddess of the moon. But if we return to the practical element, moving away from mythology, the primary purpose of the moon in ancient cultures is as that timekeeper. And the earliest record we have of this is from small portable objects that ancient tribes, nomadic tribes, would carry around. So we're talking about the Upper Paleolithic era now, sort of Ice Age, when you have objects like bones or tusks or stones that are engraved or notched with patterns that could perhaps depict the days between each phase of the moon. So you've got the Ashango bone here. This is a fibula of a baboon, which is marked with notches representing the 29-day cycle of the moon. Or the Abri Blanchard bone from Dordogne Valley in France, where you have a beautiful set of notches here. And I'll just show a kind of diagram it, where you're not only counting the moon, but they're sort of representing the shape of the moon, which is again thought to be like a portable lunar calendar. and showing how it repeats over that 29-day period. And of course, this is an era when you have fantastic cave paintings. And if you move forward to the Cro-Magnon era, you have the paintings in the Dordogne, Iscan Valley, again in the Dordogne Valley in France, where there's already an association with the skies. Here is the bull with the Pleiades. This is Taurus the bull. Here's his head in the sky with the Pleiades hanging over his shoulder. And elsewhere amongst the same cave paintings, you have a beautiful horse, but again, 29 spots, which are thought to represent the lunar cycle. And even perhaps a little loop here, showing when it goes invisible due to the full moon. Or elsewhere, 13 dots, and then with an absence, perhaps within that square, representing the absence of the moon. Now, all of these are kind of speculative, so, we can't go back 30,000 years and ask them actually what they meant. But nonetheless, they're all kind of conducive to the idea of monitoring time. And there are other suggestions. For example, you've got prehistoric stone monuments. We all know that a lot of these were lined to, with features of sunrise and sunset. What is less appreciated is they're also associated with lunar rise and lunar set, and mark, the best observation point. So here is one example of a burial mound in Ireland, which is aligned along certain moon alignments, and within it you've got curbstones which are engraved. Some of them, you can't see this, but you just have to take my word for it, they've got crescents and arcs and circles which could possibly represent the moon. And in particular, there's one curbstone, and I will want to stress that this is speculative, but there's certainly one researcher who very strongly believes that the markings on it here, especially in the top right corner, are the earliest map of the moon. Compare those concentric arcs with a picture of the moon, and you can see that maybe you might have a point. And if that's true, then possibly over here and here, these represent how those marks rotate as the moon crosses the sky. And so this represents the early morning moon when it's just rising. But curiously, this would represent when the moon is under the ground, so a bit strange. And of course, it's not just prehistoric monuments all through the Neolithic period in Europe. This is also a feature you have in the Americas. Now, obviously, it's not contemporaneous with times, but if we look at the Anasazi people, so they're inhabiting places like Colorado in the Midwest, they showed a great knowledge of lunar cycles and lunar behaviour. And there's one site called Chimney Rock, where it pinpoints a very particular thing about the moon, which you only know if you've been observing it and monitoring its behaviour for hundreds of years. And the moon's orbit wobbles slightly about the Earth. And what that means is that the moon doesn't always rise in the same place along the horizon. And in fact, from the northernmost point, going around to the southernmost and then back to the northernmost point of the moonrise, goes through a cycle every 18.6 years. And when it comes to the northern point, it kind of goes to a standstill. So it moves back and forth, and then it slows down. For about 3 years, it arises in about the same northernmost point. Now, the Anasazi people knew of this cycle, we think, because they have built, about 1,000 years, they built a great house, an observation point. You see a building here, ignore it. It's Fire Warden's observation point. That's 20th century. But here, we're looking at these ruins, and you look along the ridge, and you have Chimney Rock and its companion. And when the moon is at that standstill, from that observation point, it rises exactly between those two rocks. And so we don't think that is just a chance coincidence. It shows a deep understanding of the significance of the moon. In terms of keeping records, though, everything I've said up to here, as I said, is speculation. We're just interpreting the markings, the positions, the alignments that these people have left behind. It's not until you get to the Babylonians that people are actually recording their observations. And these are the first people to keep a consistent record of all their observations of the sky. So, these are the cuneiform clay tablets. And they're not just looking at the planets, but they're looking at the times and the dates of moon rises and moon sets and where the moon is relative to the stars. And they use this data. It's not just recording it, they're using it to try and make predictions, to make lunar calendars that extend into the future. But they're doing this without an understanding of the geometry of the Sun, Earth, Moon system. So, for example, they were unable to predict lunar eclipses or solar eclipses. The understanding didn't extend that far. And you've got this systematic record keeping along with still this vision of the moon as a goddess. Most often represented as a lunar crescent or a circular disc. So you've got Egyptian and Babylonian tablets, documents. Here you have a king presenting his daughter, who seems to be headless now, it looks like. Maybe that's just the... Anyway, presenting his daughter to the god. And this is witnessed by Ishtar, the pointed star. You've got the moon goddess, and you've got the sun. And similarly, this is a legal document. And you've got the star, the moon, and the sun overseeing, ratifying this statement. In terms of actually observing it, you don't just have the Babylonians, but of course you have the Chinese astronomers. Meticulous, persistent, accurate records of all celestial phenomena. And, the astronomers were directly employed by the emperors to chart the heavens, record what phenomena, because what happened in the heavens reflected what was on Earth. So it's tied up with astrology, and their jobs were to chart time, so you've got the moon as a timekeeper, announce the first day of every month, and predict lunar eclipses. And so altogether they've got 1,600 observations of solar and lunar eclipses marked down and recorded since 750 BC. And the fact they could predict them showed that they were aware of the relative positions or the geometry of the Earth, Moon and Sun. But if we move to the Greeks, this is the point where you are moving beyond just observation and mythological interpretation of the moon, but you are now trying to understand about the moon. And it's often said that the first proper scientist is Thales of Miletus. Now, he was a Phoenician by birth, so he's immersed already in that Egyptian, that Babylonian tradition of astronomy and observation. And he's the first person who made the break towards finding explanations for the existence of things and phenomena, using theories and hypotheses, in other words, initiating science. And he's reported, he's 6th century BC, and the reports don't come till 300 years later, but he's still reported to be the first person who comes up with the idea that the moon shines by reflecting the light from the sun. He also claimed that the eclipse of the sun occurs when the moon passes directly in front of it. And very clearly, what he's also saying here, there's a quote from what he's representing as saying, that the moon is of an earthly nature, even though it gives an appearance of the disk. So this is the first idea that, again, the moon is scientifically a place, it's an object. Of course, this all comes to, Plato comes along, pours scorn on all these ideas. The moon is part of the perfect heavens, it's divine, it's created by the deity, it's got to be perfect. And that really is the idea that begins to persist, that the moon is a perfect sphere, perfect, shiny, untarnished thing, because it's part of the heavens. Though his pupil Aristotle had slightly different views. He had, in some of his writings, he expresses the view that there could be as yet unknown animals that live on the moon. So, okay, how about that? The moon is a place that things live on, it must have a solid surface. But then he's also toying with the idea of what is the moon made of. And there's this general idea at the time that things connected with heat and light are high in the heavens, so like the sun. And things that are wet and heavy are connected with the earth. And the moon is seen as somewhere between the two. So the moon is like an intermediary between the earth and the outer heavens, between the earth and the sun and the stars. And it's a bit of a mix of the two, a little bit unspecified. But again, you're looking at the nature of the moon. And I know we're hearing about the tides this afternoon, but just to flag that Aristotle also mused about these sort of ebbings and the risings of the sea that come round with the moon and upon certain fixed times. And if you think about it, the tides in the Mediterranean aren't that high. So it's not like it's an everyday feature of Greek life. And it may be straightforward to see that the tides are associated with the moon and when it appears in the sky. But there's always a lag, and it doesn't necessarily explain the second high tide of a day. So the connection isn't straightforward, but I think maybe we'll hear more about that this afternoon. And then by the 4th and 5th centuries BC, you really have gone from that speculative and poetic idea of the moon to including material reality of the planets, also their relative sizes, their relative separations. You've got Aristarchus by the 3rd century BC, who is using lunar eclipses, using simple geometry by just seeing how long it takes the moon to move through the Earth's shadow, timing that, and using all the relative geometry to find the distance to the moon. And his calculation said, that, okay, the moon is about 60 Earth radii away, which is actually pretty spot on. So it's amazing how much they could do in terms of understanding the geometry and the relative sizes and distances of the lunar objects. Moving on, you start to build the idea of how is the moon and the sun and the earth and all the other planets related. And you have the idea started with Hipparchus, where you have the Earth at the centre and the other bodies of the solar system move in concentric circles around it, okay, modified by little epicycles, that is built on and encapsulated by Ptolemy. And now you're getting the moon also, I mean, okay, so this is not a Greek representation, but you've got the moon as an intermediary between the Earth and the outer stars. And you're concerned less with the nature of the moon, but it's a spot on a geometric diagram, okay? So its nature is changing. But after the end of that huge burst of Hellenistic thought, you come to the Romans, who were less concerned with abstract ideas of the moon, more about its utility as a timekeeper, as a calendar, as its, perhaps a way of predicting the weather. And the only real mention we get of the moon in Roman times that's sort of scientific comes from Pliny the Elder. And he summarises current thinking about the moon. And again, the idea that the light from the moon is reflected light from the sun is now entrenched in the idea. So we now clearly have an idea. The moon is a separate, it's a solid body, how it shines, and it's a mix between the earthly and the pure heavenly. But at that point, things stall in terms of scientific development. All the scientific writings of the Greeks, they don't move into Europe, they move east towards the Arabic world, and the tradition of scientific thought is kept alive in the Islamic tradition and Islamic scientists. All the, in Europe, the idea of the views of the moon stall really till about the 12th century, until those works from the Islamic, the ancient Greeks, get translated into Latin and reintroduced into Europe and, the post-medieval world. And so ideas within Europe about scientific, there are no real ideas about the moon, no development in terms of scientific thought. It's all through sort of cultural, literal philosophy thought. Meanwhile, in the Arab world, continuation of study of the moon through many scholars, the most famous of which is Al-Haytham, who is particularly concerned about developing this idea that the moon shines by reflected light from the sun. And he's interested in these maculae, these spots, and says, well, actually, maybe you've got a difference in the surface and the way it reflects the light, and that's why you get these dark patches on the moon. So here you have an interesting idea that the moon has a topography, it has differences on its surface, and the lunar appearance is telling you something about the physical reality of the surface of the moon. And moving back to Europe, things start to change by the 14th century. You've still got the moon represented as a goddess all the way through, maybe sometimes through these diagrams showing how, the Ptolemaic system of all the planets and the sun going round the Earth. By the time you get to the late 14th century, though, this link of the moon as a goddess disappears. Where the moon is portrayed, it now has a male face. Here's the Last Judgment? Got to remember. Last Judgment, okay, in the Arena Chapel in Padua. You've got God, and surrounded by all the angels. You have the sun over his left shoulder. You've got the moon on this side. And I don't think it's going to show up, but those of you perhaps in the front row, will go and put it in your favourite search engine when you get home. Look at this painting by Giotto. And the moon has a male face now. It's still depicted with a face. But it's now definitely a male face. And then moving on, you move to the 15th century before there's any surviving record of the moon as a naturalistic, as it actually looks up to then, all surviving works up to that point present the moon as a symbolic object, okay, in all the paintings, all the medieval works of art. Van Eyck, the Flemish painter, was the first one to depict the moon as it actually appears. And he depicts the moon in glorious, broad daylight. Again, I'm afraid it doesn't quite show up in here, but it's hidden in the background here. You've got a lovely gibbous moon, not dissimilar to the one that Marek pointed out you all saw in the morning on your way here. There's another one here in the background of the Knights of Christ. There's an unfinished work, and again, but there's a beautiful crescent moon with Earthshine above a flock of geese. And then look at the baptism of Christ. It's a page from a book. You've got a small section down here. Blow that up. You've got an almost full moon. And this is his representation of the moon. Very accurate representation of dark patches, the Maria on the moon, and all those, and we're the Terminator. So here the moon is now being portrayed as part of the natural world, as part of the background, as part of the kind of the scenery of Earth. And you're moving to a much more sort of minute naturalistic study of the moon, which of course comes to fruition by the time you get to Leonardo. And the moon is no longer part of the background for happenings on Earth. It becomes a field sketch. It's part of his notes. It's surrounded by his text about his musings and his thoughts and his workings on the moon. So here you have a lovely kind of charcoal sketch of the dark patches on the moon, the western half of the moon. And Leonardo is intrigued by, this idea of reflected light from the moon. What creates these dark patches? He thinks of there being oceans on the moon, and maybe the waves on the oceans change how the light is reflected. He is also concerned about this phenomenon of Earthshine. We've all seen it. If you have a very slim crescent moon, you can still see the old moon in the new moon's arms, as it were. You can see the rest of the moon just very faintly. And Leonardo was the first person to come up with the idea that what happens is that the moon is seeing, the light comes from the sun to the earth, it's reflected off to the earth onto the otherwise illuminated part of the moon, and we then see that reflection. And just think what a leap of understanding that that represents to be able to interpret what Earthshine is in 1500. Here, the moon is now definitely an object of scientific study, scientific understanding. And if you like, the last point I want to make is then moving on another 100 years, and we're getting to 1600. And we have, and I still find it amazing, it takes till 1600 till we have the first surviving map of the moon. It was drawn by an English physician and student of magnetism called William Gilbert. And here we're no longer trying to have a naturalistic representation of the moon, but he has drawn a map of the moon. It's a flattened diagram. And I find it curious that he's only marked out the dark patches. He hasn't put craters or other light patches or other features of the moon on. But he's gone beyond just diagramming the moon. He has now mapped the moon. He has assigned names to regions of the moon. And I'm trying to work out which one it is. One of these, here we are, that's Britannia, by the way. An alternative Britannia on the moon. So he is envisaging the moon as a mini Earth. He sees these dark patches of land surrounded by an ocean, which we now know, of course, isn't right. But nonetheless, here we have an idea of the moon as a place that we might need a map of. And this is contemporaneous, of course, with the early eras of colonization and cartography, so it's not out of context that somebody at this point is going to draw a map of the moon. But what I find exciting is, when you have maps of places, those are places you want to go, those are places where you might need maps. And so this is the point where perhaps we have the first idea of the moon as a destination, a moon that perhaps we might one day go and visit. Thank you very much. Now, I gather we've got a short time for questions. Marek, how are we doing for time?
We're doing okay for time. Yeah.
So if you do have any questions, and I will stress that I am not a historian of science. I am an astronomer. So do bear with me if you ask me very detailed questions. I may not be able to answer, but yeah, question at the back.
Thales was always supposed to have predicted an eclipse of the sun. Have you dismissed that?
I was unaware that he was... I mean, it wouldn't surprise me. Thales seemed to be able to do everything out of context. So I would not surprise me at all that he was able to do this prediction of the sun. But I was unaware of that. Thank you. Okay, that's good. Yes?
Thank you. That was really interesting. My question is about telescopes. So in the chronology that you were talking about,
I'll repeat the question. Thank you. That is such a good question. Of course, that's what I should have said. Because I have taken you right up to the point to 10 years before Galileo turns the telescope to the moon. So everything there is all unaided eye observations and deductions. So that's a really important point. Thank you for making it. So I've taken you to 10 years before Galileo first turns a telescope to the moon. And that's when the science leaps away and really develops.
Yes, my question is about the supposed alignments at Stonehenge to the lunar rising planets. What's the current view about that? I mean, it seemed very compelling that there were alignments associated with the moon at Stonehenge. Is that still the case?
I believe it's still the case that certainly there are some alignments to the moon at Stonehenge. Sometimes it gets difficult to to disentangle what are solar alignments and what are lunar alignments, but I believe, as you say, there's compelling evidence that a component... I think the dominant thing is the solar alignments, but there is compelling evidence that there is some lunar association within the alignments of the stones.
I heard that when they excavated the new visitor centre, that they discovered that the post-holes weren't post-holes or something, and that in fact the lunar alignments have gone away, but if it's not your field, then...
I think you need to ask English Heritage about that, I don't know.
How did the people many moons before Leonardo actually explain Earthshine?
I have no idea. There's no... So the question, if you didn't hear, is, how do people account for Earthshine before Leonardo explained it? And I've been unable to find any account of anybody considering it before, or, trying... They obviously saw it, you could see it in the Van Eyck painting, but in terms of interpreting what it is, I haven't been able to find any record of that.
Just a quick question. I assume the first depiction of a crater had to wait for the telescope. Is that right or not?
As far as I know, it certainly didn't appear on Gilbert's map, but I still think that you can tell there are definite light spots on the moon with the unaided eye. So that's something I don't quite understand, because the trouble is it's very difficult to divorce what you already know about of the moon through binoculars or maps to your interpretation with the unaided eye. But I believe that people have seen there were light spots on the moon as well as these dark regions, so I don't understand why it doesn't seem to be part of his depictions.
It was interesting you talked about Mare and the seas, and some people sort of light grey areas as seas. Later on, there was dark grey areas became seas.
Well, the original name, when Pliny talks about the Maria, he calls them, I forgot what the word is, speculi or something, which means spot. Again, it's the idea of the moon is a heavily, it's a perfect body that is tarnished by these spots and things. So, maculae, that's the word I'm looking for. Thank you, maculae. And so there is, this idea that these are dark spots on the moon. The name Maria comes from the concept of them being seas on the moon. Yet you see when he's doing the cartography, it's all reversed. So it just shows the level of ignorance, I'm afraid, about...
Thank you.
You said the Chinese predict eclipses of the moon.
Yes.
What understanding did they have to do that? Do you know anything about
What understanding?
Yes.
The point of it was tied up with astrology. An eclipse was a bad event. Okay, so eclipses of the moon and eclipses of the sun, these were frightening events. And you need to know when one is happening. The sort of apocryphal story, it's the idea of a big dragon coming and eating the sun or something like that, and you have to go out and you make noise and you scare the dragon away. And so knowing what's happening when and being prepared to spring into action to scare the dragon away is it's all tied up with the astrology and the mythology of what's happening, more than the actual scientific understanding. So it's the ability to predict when it's happening is important, rather than actually understanding the mechanics of the whole system as such, as an abstract idea.
But the idea of a regular phenomenon
Yes.
didn't conflict with the idea of a dragon coming to gold.
Well, who knows what dragons behave like? They may well have, you know, cycles of behaviour that are driven by things that we don't know. But again, the Chinese knew about, there's this, it's approximately 18-year cycle of repeating patterns of eclipses, and they knew that down to a T. They had got that mastered. So again, the meticulous observations. So you can make these predictions by projecting your observations without necessarily a full understanding of you know, the proper geometry of the system. But nonetheless, you have got an understanding of repetitive behaviour, which I think is amazing, that they're actually able to do it just from accumulating all those meticulous observations.
You just mentioned the areas of ignorance back in the past. Where are the areas of ignorance today on lunar studies?
Well, I'm very tempted to answer that question at length, but I worry that I might usurp some of the afternoon speakers' conversation. And I'm being nodded at here, so I think you wait and see. I would say we've learned a huge amount about the moon, obviously, you know, but the moon still remains, in many ways, just as enigmatic. And it's time we knew a bit more about the moon, I think. Yeah.
Is there any evidence that transitory lunar phenomena were observed and recorded in antiquity? So bright flashes due to meteorite strikes?
I'm not aware of any in antiquity, apart from, I think there's one case, and I'm sorry, I'm pulling this out of my memory, but a medieval monk tending in a garden sees a bright flash on the moon, which is thought to be, sorry, maybe somebody in the audience knows better than I do, but I have a memory that that's the only recording of, you know, some transitory event associated with the moon, and it's thought that it was you know, obviously a space rock landing and creating a crater.
Hello. You mentioned the word, did you mention the word marred, or you said marily?
Maria.
Maria.
It's a Latin word for seas.
Right, that wasn't, sorry. That was
No, it's fine.
The Spanish word for sea is mar as well, and I just wondered if there's any connection, obviously there is.
Sorry, the what?
The Spanish word for sea is mar.
Yes, so there is a direct connection. It's from the same Latin root. Yeah. Sorry, it will come back to you.
You showed a photo of a site in Ireland. Was this Newgrange?
Oh, sorry, it's Nouth. Nouth in Ireland. Sorry, I should have mentioned its name.
Okay, I think the monk was around about 1060 by the way, approximately that sort of period, who recorded the transitory flash.
Oh, right, thank you. Right. So I wasn't too far off then, medieval monk.
Yeah, just one answer to when the mountains on the moon were first really certified. That's Galileo and Starry Messenger looking at the phases of the moon and seeing the mountains and craters emerging.
Mm-hmm.
But my point is an essential footnote on Leonardo, to your nice observations on Leonardo. When he looks at the ashen light on the moon, he says we don't just need to understand its reflections, but we need to know how the eye works. And he says where the lunar crescent appears against the dark background, that fringe of the moon appears lightest. And where the darker bit of the moon appears against the black of the void, it appears lighter. So he's also saying there's a subjective element to this. We need to understand the phenomenon, but we also need to understand how we see it, which is kind of smart.
Yeah, so it's our perception of the light as well as how the light is itself reflected. Yeah. I think there was one final question at the front here, Merritt.
Okay, right.
We're told the moon is moving away from us slowly,
Mm-hmm.
and your talk goes quite a few 100,000 or a few thousand years back in history. Has any sort of work been done on possible effects that the moon could have had on the Earth going back thousands of years, like you have done? I'm assuming it's going to be that closer to the Earth.
Well, this again is a very interesting story. I mean, the moon is moving further away from the Earth, but it's only 3 centimetres per century. Okay, but it's all tied up with the Earth and Moon as a dual system, and because part of the effect of the Moon and the Moon's gravity is it's breaking the rotation of the Earth ever so slightly by every century. And some of these observations of eclipses, going back to antiquity, some of these meticulous observations can allow us to show that the Earth's day has changed, because you will have a record of an eclipse that happening, and it can only have happened in the afternoon or at night if the day length was different then. So we have so this is part of the evidence that we have for the effect of the Moon moving further away. It's taking angular momentum from the Earth is slowing down. It's tiny amounts, but as you say, measured over millennia, or centuries, it adds up to a slight mismatch. So I think some of the oldest records, the Earth is about a quarter of a turn out from where it should be when the eclipse is happening. So again, that's just a testament to some of these fantastic records and their relevance still today for understanding of the Moon's behaviour.